Okay, it's recording. Hello. Welcome to the first episode of Breaking Bio. So this is going to be a new initiative to try to promote and share diversity within conservation specifically, and hopefully in the future within the entire STEM field. Can you see like my little rainbow? It's just like hand right now.
Yes.
Here with Jennifer. She is one of my best friends, and she is also a conservationist, although we come from very different backgrounds. And the whole idea behind this initiative is that we're going to interview people for all different aspects of conservation, and then we're going to go ahead and share these interviews so people can get a sense of all the different types of careers that exist within conservation. And the cool part is that once we get all these different interviews together, the idea is then to share it with all kinds of different people, especially with kids who are starting their journeys into figuring out what careers they want to take, what they want to study, and yeah, making conservation more accessible. So I work with an NGO called Rainforest Trust, and yeah, I will be your friendly Gabi person for this meeting. Introduce yourself, Jennifer.
So my name is Jennifer. I, like Gabby said, I'm a conservationist. I actually am currently a volunteer wildlife rehabber. And so I work with all sorts of local wildlife, basically working with them and hopefully releasing them back into the wild, which is exhausting but extremely rewarding, and yeah, always makes for really awesome stories, some of which aren't necessarily shall we say, things that you can share loudly in a public space because they can gross people out. So lots of stories.
Factor, I think, on this channel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, you work with critters, you're gonna get covered in all sorts of stuff. So yeah, that's my life in a nutshell.
Study a lot of poop in conservation. That's like the first thing you need to know. Is a lot of the time we do study a lot of poop, especially if you're in field conservation.
Yeah, lots of poop, lots of all sorts of stuff. So sorry, that's just how it goes. All right, so go ahead and just get started. So Gabby, why don't you just tell everyone a little bit about your background and then what encouraged you to pursue a career in conservation?
Sure. So those are big and extremely important questions. So in terms of my background, so I'm a conservation biologist. I have a master's degree in conservation biology, and before I did an undergrad in geospatial stuff, so stuff like geographic information systems, remote sensing, and then I moved on to kind of more conservation biology. I specialize in human-wildlife conflict. That's kind of like where my real passion is. And what that basically means is that sometimes because people are kind of encroaching more into wildlife areas, because there's a lot more conflict between kind of what wildlife needs and local needs are, there's often a lot of conflict between the two. And trying to help wildlife and people coexist easier, especially in places where it's kind of on that cutting edge, so where animals are coming in eating crops or predators are killing livestock. So how do you mitigate that? And also work within the existing culture and getting solutions from within, a local context is really important. But yeah, so I kind of specialize more in predator livestock conflicts. So looking at movement ecology, so how predators move, looking in terms of how to be able to work within a social science context with farmers to be able to build tolerance, reduce loss.
Oh, we're kind of cutting out a little bit.
Oh, no worries. Yeah.
Oh, no, we're good now.
Okay. And in terms of why I decided to go into conservation, so every time I write a grant proposal, like they ask me this question, and I'm just like, I really wish I had kind of like a moment. And I remember when I did my first like week in my master's degree, it was hysterical because they were all like, they had all these really inspiring stories about why they wanted to do specifically Southern African conservation issues. And I was just kind of like, I was born in Boston. I've probably watched The Lion King one too many times. I don't really remember because I've always wanted to do this. But now that I'm older, I kind of don't know where that passion came from, but I kind of know where it is now in terms of I like the puzzle. I like being able to pull a lot of interdisciplinary stuff together, social science, computer science, education, statistics, conservation biology, and being able to collaborate with people from all these different fields as well as kind of incorporate different aspects into my own work and solving kind of what we call like wicked problems, which all my folks in New England, like wicked is like a good thing. Like in this context, it is extremely bad. Like the wicked fish of the West, horrible problems. Just complex things, like trying to, for example, how do you stop elephants from eating crops when they're so smart and adaptable? That's incredibly complex. Or how do you work with farmers who hate wild dogs and want to kill them on site? And they might have a legitimate reason why they dislike them in terms of the fact that they do kill their cattle. So how do you work within these contexts? Yeah, so that's kind of why I'm in conservation. I'm in conservation because it's hard, but it's an extremely rewarding and meaningful life. So.
And then for you, why is it so important to conservation for it to be diverse?
That's an important point. So just getting it out there in terms of when you think of a scientist, a lot of times we think of an older white male, probably wearing a lab coat, which unless you're a geneticist or some other lab person, which they do exist in conservation as conservation geneticists, most of us aren't carrying beakers around or like pipetting or anything. There's many different types.
Unless there's fecal and samples involved, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're looking at poop really closely under a microscope, but most of the time, there is a lot of different ways to be a scientist, and you don't necessarily have to be kind of the stereotypical scientist. And one of the reasons diversity is important is that historically, conservation's had a lot of almost neo-colonial overtones, where it's people are going into other countries and kind of telling them how to conserve their own wildlife. And I think one of the really humbling moments so I did some of my undergraduate work in Kenya, and it was really cool because like I was talking to this one guy and he was just kind of like, you Americans, you lost all your megafauna, like all your really big mammals, like you wiped them all out. We still have ours, and you're telling us we're doing it wrong. It's like completely right. So I think, it's hearing from different voices is really important in conservation because these are so complex, because you need people who know policy, who know economics, who know mathematics, who know education. You need all of these people on board, and you need people who come from a lot of different backgrounds in order to be able to effectively solve these problems. And also just really being able to kind of inspire people who might not think of conservation as an actual career you can do. Like we're not all Steve Irwin, we're not, just it's
Jeff Corwin.
Exactly. Right. And clarifying that there are different career paths within this kind of broad thing that we call conservation. And I think that's really important. So I'm Brazilian American. So my dad is Black, Native Brazilian, and Portuguese. And I identify as non-binary to explain kind of what that is, because everyone's going to ask me. It means that I don't identify as a man or a woman. My sex is female, but my gender identity is kind of more of a blend of masculine and feminine. So that's kind of what diversity I bring to the table. And I think there's a lot of different, people out there who are into conservation, and just getting their voices heard is important.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then what do you think are the biggest hurdles for conservationists in this day and age? It's a big question.
Wow. You just jumped right in there. Hurdles. I think there are many. I think conservation, I think I read somewhere, and don't quote me on the source because I don't remember, but I think conservation only is 3% of all charity funding. So even out of all charity, the entire charity sector, and we're counting humanitarian things and other aspects such as that, conservation is always at the bottom, which I always think is really interesting because it's literally the future of the planet. It's we're funding it through charity. What is more important than the literal future of it's fine. Anyway, before I jump down that path, because I can't talk. My president is Bonsero, so I mean I can't talk. But I think I think the barrier is that there isn't a lot of money going around, and there isn't necessarily a lot of support from governments in many countries, not in all, but in many countries. So it's also a vocational field, and I feel like it's something that people are really passionate about, which means that a lot of people are trying to get into it, but there isn't a lot of support financially, especially since in the nonprofit model, people want their money to go towards conservation action, not towards salaries. So there's a high financial barrier. A lot of people have to do serial unpaid internships to get into the field. People who are, not upper middle class or above struggle a lot. I know I certainly struggle getting into the field because they have to take these unpaid internships, and they have to sometimes, fund their own research. And if you're, for example, lower income, or you're a working mother, or you're responsible for your family, it's difficult. I definitely think it can be done, which is why I'm not saying no one do conservation, because we need people from all walks of life, but it's also important to understand kind of like what those difficulties are to be able to better support people. I've always been a proponent of, yes, unpaid internships are difficult, and people are always just kind of like, if we didn't not pay our interns, the work wouldn't get done. And I'm like, that's not an acceptable argument to me, because I'm like, you could not do ethical research and not handle animals properly, and that would save you money, but that wouldn't be effective conservation. And I feel if you want to bring people into the field, you have to compensate them fairly and support them. Because they're the next generation, if they can't get into it, then who can? So.
Definitely, for sure. And then let's see here. I'm just skip around a little bit on the questions.
Yeah. Nice.
What's the coolest thing that you've done so far in your career?
Okay. There's been many cool things. I'm very, very lucky to have been able to work in a lot of different places. So I've worked in Kenya, South Africa, and Namibia so far, and in the States. And I helped color a lioness. That was pretty awesome. So that was really exciting. I think being able to work with all the different farmers I've worked with trying to prevent losses of livestock to predators has been really cool, because I've seen very similar issues in very different countries. But yeah, so kind of seeing the commonalities and the differences, and how people perceive different predators differently. So they might lose more predators to one species, but they really, really hate another species. So that's always been really fascinating. So yeah, I guess just being able to learn from a lot of different people on the ground has been really cool.
And then I guess since we're kind of getting over on the time, let's see, what advice do you have for anyone who is interested in a career in conservation?
Advice. So one thing I think we're going to go over later, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, but I think we're gonna go over like the different paths that you can take within conservation. So the different stages of conservation. So just, I won't get into kind of the weeds on that one, but in terms of just general advice, start early, ideally in high school. So high schoolers, I am talking to you. Middle schoolers, even better. Elementary schoolers, your parents let you on YouTube. Also, I'm sorry I cursed like in the first 5 minutes of the video, so I am going to apologize about that. But especially if you're an elementary school student. But I guess the advice would be start early, study hard, put your whole heart into it, because it is a job that is going to ask everything possible from you. But also make sure that you fight for your work-life balance, because again, because it's a career that asks so much of you, it's really easy to get sucked in and to not pace yourself. So start practicing healthy work habits early. Study languages is really helpful as well. And just the more you can read about different aspects of conservation, the more that you can get involved with talking to different people. I always say, try to build your network the best you can. If you're able to just talk to your science teacher and see if they can connect you with someone who does conservation, or connecting hopefully through this platform here. Learn about the different types of conservation that you can do, because again, you're not always pipetting. You're not always, in the field trekking through the, through the savannah or something like that. You can be, even if you're like not a scientist, there's so many different roles that are important. I think one of the big things that are underlooked is things like maybe you're really good at numbers and you could be an amazing accountant who donates to conservation or works in the conservation NGO. Or maybe you're fantastic at influencing people and you'd be a really great politician. You might want to go to law school and become a politician or environmental lawyer. There's so many different pathways to contribute. So I honestly think that like whatever skill you have, whatever you're good at, if your heart's in it and you want to contribute to wildlife in the world's last wild places and make all of this possible, you can do it. It's just because it's not a linear path, you kind of have to work with people who kind of been through it before and stay open and always stay learning. I guess that is my biggest advice.
Cool. All right. All right. Thanks for answering all those questions. I think we're going to wrap this up. And I think, let's see here. I think we can press stop recording at the top, and I think it'll cut that clip.
Awesome.
Okay.